Okay, great. Folks, thanks for joining. Welcome. My name is Madhura Maskasky. I'm one of the co-founders and VP of product at Platform 9. In Platform 9, in a nutshell, for those of you who are not familiar, what we do is we make hybrid clouds extremely easy to build and manage. Okay, and we do that through a very simple SaaS-managed portal or platform. It's built using best-of-breed open-source technologies, OpenStack, Kubernetes, Fission. You might be familiar with some or all of them. And we let you deploy these across your hybrid infrastructure, so across your private cloud environments, VMware, KVM, or public cloud. And you can learn more about us at our website, platform9.com, or reach out to us at Twitter, platform9sys. We're not going to talk about Platform 9 today. We're here today to talk about hybrid clouds, or to be specific, best practices around building hybrid clouds. Let's get started. Okay, so in terms of the agenda today, it's very simple. We're first going to start by looking at some key trends in cloud computing. I think these trends will help us establish a pretty good baseline for what comes next in the second part of the conversation. And that's when we're going to talk about some recommendations, best practices. These are based on lessons that we've learned working with our customers. These are enterprise customers, as well as lessons that are learned from the industry through research reports, analyst reports, through surveys, and so on and so forth. Okay, so, and then I would like to end with an end goal that I think every organization that is looking to build a hybrid cloud should be striving towards. I think that would be a nice conclusion to our talk. So let's get started. So let's start by talking about cloud utilization trends, or how enterprises are utilizing cloud computing to advance their developers and IT, et cetera. Okay, so the first trend, fairly obvious one, but I think still worth spending a little bit of time talking about, is that the total number of clouds being consumed by a given enterprise at any given point has been accelerating pretty rapidly. Okay, so this is based on a number of surveys. I'm going to talk about some of them here, but the average number of clouds used by any given organization, mid to large size organization, is growing. And that's resulting in some non-trivial amount of cost and complexity that IT staff needs to manage. So as a quick snippet, talking about this data point, here is a graph from the State of the Cloud survey. This survey is run by RightScale. They run this survey almost every year. And it provides some really interesting tidbits in terms of the overall cloud consumption or infrastructure as a service consumption by enterprises. And this year's survey, what it reports is that it says that on average, companies use at most 5 cloud providers, including private and public cloud at any given point. Right? That's a pretty significant number. Almost 81% of the enterprises who participated said that they use more than one cloud, either a multi-cloud or a hybrid cloud, which includes private and public. And then both the adoption for public as well as private cloud has gone up compared to the previous years. Now, the public cloud adoption going up is pretty well known. There are multiple researchers and surveys that go out that talk about growth in public cloud adoption. But what's also interesting is that private cloud simultaneously is also growing in a non-trivial manner. Right? So just across 2017 to 2018, private cloud saw growth from 72% to about 75% or so. So that was trend number one. Trend number two, which kind of builds off of the first trend, is that the number one pain point or the number one challenge that majority of IT executives or CIOs experience today is no longer cloud adoption, but it is cloud cost optimization. So in other words, managing or mitigating costs for your cloud deployment tends to be the number one challenge for all or majority of IT executives. I thought this is pretty insightful, and I wanted to add further insight to it by referencing this really interesting research report by 451 Research. They published this earlier this year, and I recommend everyone to download it, read it. It's got some really insightful information about just the overall utilization of cloud resources by enterprises. But the very key insight as part of that report, it kind of centers around this graph, which I wanted to blow out so that everyone kind of gets to read through it. But what it's trying to map is that on the y-axis, it's mapping the cloud expenditure. So that's the total costs or your total spend on cloud as an organization. Okay, and then on the x-axis is mapping across time. So what it's trying to do is trying to plot the curve of the total costs spent on cloud by an organization across time and across their life cycle through their journey of cloud adoption. And so there are some really interesting inflection points as part of this graph that I would like for us to go through together. So the journey starts with what they call great expectations, right? Which is where a mid to large size organization decides to embark on their cloud journey, typically public cloud journey. So that's when they take a non-trivial switch cost. That's the cost that you take when you decide to migrate your applications to a public cloud, and which is where you see that initial spike in the first portion of the graph there. But what's interesting is that after that initial spike, you see the costs actually going down significantly. And what the report attributes this to is that there is a fair bit of consolidation of resources and processes and management that happens because typically an organization decides to move a diverse set of resources to a single public cloud to start with. And so that consolidation is the primary reason for a fair bit of reduction in cost that the organization kind of initially starts experiencing. So this is kind of the honeymoon phase, right? This is the phase where, as a new consumer of a cloud, you're experiencing agility, better productivity, and you're starting to see some potential of cost reduction. So what this results in is an organization-wide growth of public cloud consumption. And that kind of takes us to the interesting part of the journey, which is the second and third parts of this graph, which is at some point, as you are kind of well underway in your cloud migration or cloud transition journey, and I want to kind of quote what the report said here. It says that despite all the excitement, costs slowly and surely ramp up to what they call wuthering heights. I had to look up that word. But in post-migration, cloud costs are the number one pain point for majority of organizations. And what's interesting is that they attribute this to two reasons, which in our experience both have been extremely valid and relevant in what we've heard from almost all enterprise organizations. The first one is resource sprawl. Right? So as you start ramping up on your cloud consumption, you start having orphaned resources, you have orphaned VMs, orphaned containers that are just not being tracked, but they continue charging up your bill. You get over-provisioned resources because you're putting capacity for that just-in-time usage. And then there are these unknown line items in the bills like bandwidth costs or storage costs or migration costs or so on and so forth. So overall, these kind of add up towards skyrocketing of costs. The second part, though, I found that to be more interesting, which is called Jevons paradox, if I'm pronouncing it right. And what that really states is that because of the extremely low barrier to entry, which is resources are available for a very easy access, and the unit costs appear to be extremely low, which is true, right? Public clouds always publish their unit costs, which are always really low. These two together result in, across the board, across developers and administrators, ramping up their total usage of the resources in a pretty significant manner. So the unit cost still remains low, but the overall cost kind of starts skyrocketing in a big way. So the total bill to an organization from their cloud consumption really starts growing up. Okay, so that's kind of that second phase of this graph. And that's where you reach an inflection point, which is that orange-colored bubble in the graph here, which they call the tale of two options. And that is a point that an organization reaches where if you're large enough, then one or two options or a combination of both might be more cost-effective to you. The first one is what is called repatriation, which is you consider migrating some of the resources out of the public cloud back into the private cloud. And the second one is resource governance. So this is where you start employing really strict policies around visibility and cost management and who gets to deploy where and resources, how do they get reclaimed and so on and so forth. And so once you imply one or two or a combination of these, then you start getting more into a steady state where your cloud costs start they at least stop exacerbating in terms of their growth. So the moral of the story for this graph here is that the top challenge for a lot of IT executives or CFOs or CIOs, once you are well underway in your cloud adoption journey, is cost. or how to mitigate or manage costs. Let's go past there. Trend 3. This has become kind of an obvious one, but Kubernetes adoption continues to gain momentum as the de facto container orchestration layer as more and more organizations adopt cloud native. Right, so this is, again, a little snippet from the RightScale State of the Cloud survey. And there have been multiple similar surveys that talk about this data. But this particular survey shows that Kubernetes saw the fastest growth amongst all of the various relevant container management tools and platforms and et cetera. So it almost doubled and reached about 27% current adoption with about 36% projected adoption for 2018. So this is a well-known fact now. Kubernetes has risen to be the #1 container orchestration framework for a number of reasons. An architecture that's designed to scale and a very strong, thriving community are just some of those. But what that results in for an organization is there is a completely new vocabulary of open source tools and technologies that you now need to familiarize yourself with. Right, so some examples, these are just some tools in the ecosystem that handle network management or service mesh or serverless. But so this is a plethora of new open source tools that you as an IT team now needs to be familiar with. And what that means is that you need to hire or build that skilled open source talent who's able to have a conversation with this vocabulary and is able to operate with it, which is a very hard thing to do. And it's even harder to retain that talent. So it is a very well-known Bay Area fact, for example, that the topmost Kubernetes talent is always floating around across various companies because they will keep getting poached around or hired by several other organizations. And so what that results in for a company is a severe effect on their time to market or time to value. Okay, and that takes us to the last trend, which is a little bit of surprise probably, but it's that serverless is taking the lead as the top consumed cloud service. So serverless has become the top consumed cloud service for 2018, and it's growing. And so this is, again, some tidbits of data from the state-of-the-art survey from RightScale, as well as another similar survey run by Cloudability that surveys across a lot of users across private and public clouds. And what the survey is showing in the first chart, in the first table, it's comparing the growth of serverless year over year and comparing that to other as-a-service offerings that are also popular. So it's comparing it to containers as a service, database as a service, DR as a service. And what we see is that serverless has had the highest rate of growth, which has grown 75%. And then the bottom chart shows that even just within the year 2018, across quarter over quarter, serverless is projected to grow at a very significant pace. Right? And what I find really interesting, and Platform 9 has had some experience with serverless. We built Fission, which is the open source framework for doing serverless on top of Kubernetes. What we find interesting as we interface with users who are looking to utilize serverless is that a lot of them are quote unquote hardcore traditional enterprise users with enterprise use cases. Which is slightly different from how technology adoption typically happens. You typically see the front runners as being the early startups or high-tech companies or et cetera. But a lot of publicly cited use cases for serverless from Amazon Lambda or others, et cetera, as well, have been from companies like Coca-Cola or Travelex, and they're using those in association with use cases which have very significant revenue associated with them. And I think the reason is because serverless offers you instantaneous scale with least amount of effort, and it also offers the potential for significant cost reduction because it lures you into the promise that you're only paying for resources as they're being consumed, which is true. There's nothing wrong with it. In the end, you realize that the overall complexity kind of also ends up scaling the cost to a certain level, but that's the promise of serverless, and which is why it attracts those patterns of use cases that really need to scale and that traditionally ran with massive footprints of resources that were pretty much never used except they were there just-in-time provision for those spikes of workloads or et cetera. So that's interesting about serverless. There's also this new trend that seems to be emerging where some developers are skipping past the cloud-native microservices, container-based architecture of their applications altogether and just skipping directly to utilizing serverless, which I think is very interesting. We saw a similar skip happen when containers got introduced. Some people decided to skip virtualization altogether and just go straight from bare metal to containers. And apparently there's a similar trend that's also emerging for serverless. So let's first summarize the trends, the 4 trends that we spoke about. The first one is that it looks like on average companies are utilizing at most 5 different public to private clouds. So the multi-cloud or hybrid cloud usage is growing within enterprises. The second one, cost optimization or cost mitigation is the #1 pain point that IT leadership is experiencing once cloud adoption is well underway. The third one is Kubernetes adoption continues to gain momentum as the de facto standard for container orchestration. And the fourth one is serverless is the top leading cloud service for 2018 in the SaaS services, SaaS cloud services consumed category. So if you map across these 4 trends, right, what they really map down to is that the 2 most important factors that any enterprise must take into account while building their hybrid cloud strategy is cost mitigation and complexity mitigation. Cost mitigation is obvious. We spent a good amount of time talking about it. But if you think of across the pattern, across organizations utilizing multiple clouds and Kubernetes gaining momentum and serverless gaining momentum, is what it's doing is that it's adding a layer of complexity that an IT organization now needs to handle, right? You already had to deal with bare metal and VMs. Now you have to deal with containers and container orchestration frameworks and a whole bunch of tools around them. And then this future thing of serverless, which you might or might not be ready for today, is something you always still have to plan for. Okay, so now that we've talked about some of these trends and patterns and looked at some of the data that helps us back that, let's talk about some recommendations or how should an IT organization, in particular, one that might be relatively early or new in their cloud adoption journey or cloud native adoption journey, how should they navigate and what choices should they attempt to make early on in order to come out ahead with respect to some of these challenges that we just looked at. Okay, so recommendation 1, get an early handle on cost strategy, which is resource governance should not be an afterthought, but it should be a very critical part of your overall cloud strategy. Right, so going back to that 451 research survey that we referenced earlier, that survey cites that one inflection point which we talked about, where it says that at least for large organizations, and they try to map this out by mapping how many VMs on average should you be running per engineer, and then what's kind of the utilization percentage of your compute, storage, network resources that you're targeting or that you realistically are going to achieve. And then based on that, they plot and they show that there is that inflection point, there's that break-even point at which migrating some of your resources from a public cloud to a private cloud and or investing heavily in a resource governance policy where you have broad visibility across all of your spend, you have cost comparisons, and you have policies that will let you very quickly react to any changes to cost or et cetera, becomes a far more effective strategy to just going in a single public cloud direction. So, and then on the other side, the bar chart is showing one sample survey that they ran where they asked users, how many of you have migrated an application back out of public cloud into a private cloud over the past 12 months? And an interesting 35% or so responded with saying yes, that we have migrated at least one or more of our applications back from public cloud to private cloud. So So knowing this, and now that this data is available, if an organization is investing in their cloud strategy and they're relatively early in the journey, there is potential to not make some of those mistakes and hence invest early on in what would be the right hybrid cloud strategy, which is consider incorporating at least one private cloud as part of your overall cloud strategy. And also invest early on in the right resource governance and waste management tools. And there are a number of them. And there are platforms that are also available that let you do all of this in a built-in kind of way. But having that visibility into cost and not having cost as an afterthought is one of the most important aspects of having a successful hybrid or a multi-cloud strategy. Recommendation 2. Curb your resource sprawl by focusing on automation with the right tools. So invest in products that are API first, automation first. Again, very obvious, right? Gets said pretty often. But one thing that's not always so obvious is that if the cloud adoption does not happen with an appropriate strategy in place, that's put in place by either the engineering organization or the IT organization, then an organic growth in your cloud adoption can take you as an organization into a massive tool sprawl problem. So what is tool sprawl? It's an issue where you organically start building independent point tools that are experts at handling each of those individual endpoints, either private cloud endpoints or public cloud endpoints or specific platform. Like this tool I have for container networking, and this one is for container compute, and then separate tools for VM storage and compute. And this happens very naturally unless someone has taken explicit steps for it to not happen. And then there are correspondingly different admins that are managing different sets of tools. And what this leads into is a complete nightmare where each of these now needs to be updated and upgraded, and the version compatibility needs to be kept into mind, and et cetera. So organizations will typically get into this state either through just organic growth, which has been not controlled, or the other most common scenario in which companies get into this is when there is a lot of inorganic M&A that's happening and companies acquire a lot of IT assets through various different sources, which at that point you don't have control in that scenario. Well, you at least do in the first scenario, where by being very conscious about what tools you're investing in and what platforms they're going to let you manage, you can reduce the environment sprawl and hence the tool sprawl. So one good example is Kubernetes, which is, everyone knows, open source alternative, which acts as a very powerful abstraction layer for container management across your clouds, across your private, your public cloud, and so forth. Right? So just deciding on investing in Kubernetes early on instead of having a container sprawl and choosing the right tool later could add a lot of value in your hybrid cloud strategy. One thing to consider here is always good to evaluate open source alternatives to the other closed source or public cloud only options that you might have available. Recommendation 3, make sure that you're future-proofing your hybrid cloud deployment, which is standardized on products that support a broad spectrum of technologies and not just particular segments of technology well. Right, so we did see in the previous section of this presentation, where we talked about serverless as becoming the number one cloud service in the category of overall cloud services that get consumed by users. So as an organization, even if you might not be ready to consume serverless today because your developers are just barely getting ready to be cloud native and using containers, knowing this trend lets you know that it's only a matter of time before your developers are going to come knocking at your door and say that we need support for serverless, we need to do it on public cloud or private cloud, or we need to do it in a generic way. So knowing that, it helps to future-proof yourself and invest, again, in tools that let you handle not just the needs of your organization for today, but also for tomorrow. So as an example, again, I always like to mention open source alternatives. That's something that we are experts at. Fission is an open source alternative for doing serverless on top of Kubernetes. I have to mention that Fission is something that Platform 9 has built. It's completely open source framework, and it can run anywhere Kubernetes can run, which means it can run on your laptop, it can run in a private cloud, or it can run in public cloud or across hybrid. So that can be an effective way of making sure you have a solution for handling serverless, which is also integrated well with your Kubernetes solution, if that's what you're also standardizing on. And you now have that covered for when your developers become ready to start deploying serverless applications. And this graph just shows a simple Google Trends map. One of the things I typically like to do is just map out Google Trends keywords comparisons and then use that as an insight to where what is becoming popular. It's something a lot of people do. So here we are comparing containerization keyword to serverless keyword. And then we map that over a period of about 5 years. And you can see what is, I think at this point, become pretty obvious. But the red line is the serverless line, which has seen a kind of upwards trajectory over the past few years, at least, in a pretty significant way. Okay, so those are the primary recommendations. Like I said in the beginning, I'd like to end with an end goal. And I think that ideal end goal for an organization to achieve is where you're achieving value-adding consumption of a diverse pool of cloud resources. Okay, so what do I mean by that? It is possible to reach a state if you as an organization have invested in the right hybrid cloud management strategy, where you have control over waste management, you've invested in select tools that let you manage a broad spectrum of technologies, then you can reach sort of a steady state or an equilibrium where your costs are still growing, okay? But they're growing at a very steady low rate. And that rate is proportional to the revenue benefit that your company as a whole is achieving, because you're getting significant time to value benefits. You're getting significant productivity gains. You're getting agility gains. And so the growth of the cost is mapping in proportion to the growth of the revenue that your organization as a whole is having. And that's kind of the ideal state to get to. And anytime you kind of diverge away from that, where costs are skyrocketing, or your agility and time to value is dropping, then you're kind of outside of that equilibrium. So that's it. That's all I had. Feel free to reach out, Madhura Maskasky on Twitter. You can always DM me, or Platform 9 Systems is my company handle. Happy to take any questions, etc. Otherwise, everyone have a great evening. All right.